Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We will be sharing findings from our new IT compliance survey. My name is Mike, and I will be your host for today. Just to let everyone know, this webinar is being recorded and will be available in the next 48 hours. You can also access the PDF and slide deck and resources window located on your screen. You can also submit any questions that you have at any point of the presentation, and our speakers will answer them at the Q&A. I will now send it over to our speakers, Matt and JC.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. This is Matt Lato. It's a pleasure to have everybody here on the call. I appreciate everybody, taking time out of your day to spend with us. We're really excited to talk about the results of our first annual IT compliance survey. I'm not going to really talk through my experiences and all that. I'm the Chief Growth Officer for Hyperproof. Put succinctly, we're focused on compliance, and so we're really excited. This is real interesting stuff to us, and I'll let JC introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jing Feng Zhao, but I go by JC, and I'm the Director of Content Marketing for Hyperproof, and I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you guys today.
All right. So, whoops. Sorry, guys. That's the problem with having two people with the ability to click the button. But so the agenda for today, everybody. We know we have an hour, and so we're in the first 50 minutes here. We're going to accomplish the first 5 bullet points. We wanted to talk a little bit about the methodology, just to make sure that part's clear. We won't spend a lot of time there. More importantly, we want to talk about the top 10 stats, from the survey. So what did we find interesting in the results that we compiled? We also want to talk about the risk landscape and the implications for businesses, which is a real interesting topic, I think, for all of us. And then, the benchmarks. What were the benchmarks that you can use within your own organizations to kind of vet and understand kind of where you are in relationship to these benchmarks? We're going to talk through those. And then finally, we'll end with, the 3 items, that we think as businesses we should all focus on and what we've learned, through this first annual survey. And then at the end, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A, so we really look forward to that. As Mike said, please feel free to present as the questions come. Please just go ahead and then type them in, and we'll do everything we can to talk to all of those questions at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll hand it over to JC.
So let's just spend a moment on the survey methodology. So for the survey, we collected the data very recently, back in November of 2019. We have 526 qualified respondents who took the survey, and all of those folks work for U.S.-based organizations. We wanted to hear from organizations of all sizes across the spectrum of compliance maturity as well. So, here you can see over here, that's the breakdown of how many respondents came from each size segment. And here below, this is how we define the segments for the study. And throughout, when we were analyzing the data, we really looked at every single question by organization sizes to understand the differences between large versus small organizations. So as we're presenting the benchmarks, this sort of breakdown, this is what you're going to see throughout the presentation. We also wanted to make sure we were hearing from organizations who have different scope, essentially. So we have organizations, some with only 1 location, and about 50% have 2 to 4 locations. And then we have a few more organizations that have, 10 or more locations as well. So the scope of the survey is really focused around IT compliance. By that, we're really talking about IT risks, cybersecurity, and data privacy. So we wanted to hear from folks who are very knowledgeable about these issues and who are direct decision makers on these topics. As you can see here, 75% of all people in the survey are people who are directly involved in making decisions regarding data security and data privacy compliance. Another 21%, they're knowledgeable enough to understand the requirements and the needs for their organization. And then another 4%, they're doing some day-to-day operations, but they're not making decisions. And then below here is just a breakdown of how decisions regarding IT compliance are being made across the organizations in our survey. So we all know that there's a lot of nuances when it comes to IT compliance across the different industries. There are certain industries that made a lot of investments in IT compliance versus other ones that are just starting to pay closer attention to compliance that are earlier on their journey. So here's a breakdown of the top industries in our survey set. About a third of them come from the technology sector, which is where, for Hyperproof as a company, we are primarily focused on serving today. But we also have a significant number of respondents from other industries, including manufacturing, financial services, retail, and healthcare. And this is just a breakdown of what people's primary job functions are. What we found really interesting is for a significant number of respondents, IT audits and IT compliance is not their primary job function. Instead, it's one part of their overall responsibility set. And almost half of our respondents come from IT, which is not surprising. And then this is the last part of the survey methodology to just give you a sense of the seniority levels of the folks in the survey. Over 80% of people in the survey are actually leaders in their organization. They're at the director level, or president, or C-level, or SVP level. And so that's our methodology. And let's take a look at what we found to be the most interesting data points in the survey. And I'm just going to go over these data points a little bit fast because we will spend a little bit more time on these later in the presentation. So the first major thing we saw was that a significant number of organizations overall, they really want to double down on IT compliance. They really want to increase their focus and investments in this area. They view it as a critical business function. And this bears out in the data. For example, 62% of all organizations surveyed plan to increase spending on IT compliance in the next 1 to 2 years. And the amount of which they're planning to increase spending is very significant. It is not just 5% or 10% year over year. In fact, the vast majority of people surveyed said they plan to increase their spending somewhere upwards of 10% versus where they were a year ago. And 1 in 5 respondents actually expect their spending to increase somewhere between 25 to 50% year over year. Furthermore, organizations realize that their current staff is not really enough for where they want to go. So 2 out of 3 respondents plan to add additional full-time headcount to the compliance function. So one of the things we really wanted to understand was why are organizations increasing their focus and investments around this area? And this is what we found. Organizations are really concerned about cybersecurity issues and other threats that are outside of their control. And so they're feeling vulnerable and exposed. And the concerns around cybersecurity, really not surprising to us. It's really similar to what other data surveys have found as well. And then the second aspect of why organizations want to increase spending on compliance is they feel like they have to in order to expand their business. And this is because the regulatory environment has changed, and there's just more regulations organizations have to adhere to. And then further, there's also greater demand from vendors, from companies towards their vendors. And so those aspects are driving their spending increase as well. In another part of our survey, what we wanted to understand was around the cost of non-compliance. And so some interesting stats here is, many organizations have experienced compliance violations and lapses in the past few years. It's actually 1 in 5 organizations that have experienced such an issue. And the amount of loss they incurred as a result is pretty significant. The most common amount from our respondents, they said that they lost somewhere between $1 to $5 million from their non-compliance incident. That could be a significant portion of their overall business. And then we all know that technology plays a really large role in helping organizations manage their security and compliance programs. So in the survey, we took a look to see how organizations are using technology to manage their compliance programs. And what we found here is really not surprising to us and probably isn't to you either. We found that almost 60% of respondents, they're still using very basic ad hoc tools like spreadsheets and email to manage their compliance program. And because they're using such tools that really aren't built for the compliance workflows, there's a lot of administrative overhead in their processes, and people are spending a lot of time on these administrative activities. So we'll come back to some of these stats later on and go deeper, but for now, I want to turn it over to Matt to talk about the risk landscape.
Great, thanks, JC. So yeah, I mean, the risk landscape's very interesting, the world we're living in. I think that the first two aren't going to come as a surprise necessarily to people, but I think the kind of exponential growth in relationship to them is maybe what's taken us all a little bit off guard. So you look at, privacy regulations, and clearly, I think all of us are familiar with some of the regulations that were passed out of Europe, specifically GDPR. And we're seeing the first manifestations of those regulations occurring in the United States now. And CCPA is clearly an example of that. What's kind of alarming about the way, the United States is approaching it is that right now it looks like it'll be a state-by-state approach. So New York and a variety of other states are in the process of passing their own versions of the same regulation. And that is going to represent a significant impact to all of us as we try to conduct business, across geographies. This focus on privacy regulations is fine in one sense, but the kind of varied nature of how it's occurring is obviously going to impact all of us and make our lives more difficult. And so that represents a real risk to all of us, in a variety of ways. One is just, clearly there are regulations in place with significant penalties, potential penalties that can impact us and represent a risk. And then likewise, the sheer amount of resources and infrastructure it takes in order to support a piecemeal approach to privacy regulations is going to be fairly daunting for all of us as organizations as well. So we believe it represents a big risk and a growing risk for organizations as we move forward, in the next 5 to 10 years. Next are cyber attacks. This is not new to any of us. They've been around for a while, but it certainly seems, whether it's geopolitical conflicts exacerbating them, such as some of the conflict between us and Iran at this point, or otherwise, we're seeing it every day in the news. All of us are under a fair amount of, duress in relationship to these cyber attacks, and they seem to be actually scaling up, not scaling down. And we don't really see a foreseeable end, to where that plateaus or starts to level out. It's ever increasing at this point. And so that's another risk for all of us, and a real one. I mean, we can see that one, the reputational risk that presents to all of us. It, probably probably could pick up the paper every single day or read online every single day about a company having a breach and dealing with some of the reputational fallout of that, and obviously the financial fallout of that as well. The last one's very interesting to us because it's something that we're seeing a lot more consistently. For those of us that remember the 80s, there was a saying, around trust but verify. And what we've seen is this zero trust concept really be adopted to where people are no longer saying trust at the front end of that conversation. They're saying, before I can even trust you, I need to verify that you're someone I can trust. And so there's been this big pivot, as it relates to vendor management and the interactions between all of us as corporations to where people want to know is our data is stored in other services that we want to verify that they're actually taking proactive steps to secure the information that resides in their solutions. So that shift has been pretty instrumental, and we actually see that really kind of closer to its infancy at present, and growing as an extra kind of compliance risk to organizations overall. So that one's, all three of those are interesting, and they make all of our lives more complicated. So there's the current risk landscape, which is a lot of fun and a little bit scary. And I guess just in relationship to that, and I guess I've kind of stepped ahead into the points here to a degree, but these things represent real reputational risk. We all spend an inordinate amount of time focused on our businesses and growing them and trying to deliver valuable services to our clients. And you have these other risks, whether it's the privacy side or whether it's the cybersecurity or otherwise, that it doesn't take much anymore to have a pretty significant impact on your reputation. So they're more prevalent than ever, or more important than ever. We also feel, when you look at all of this, and we'll get into it a little bit more in some of the data that we walk through, is that as organizations, in a lot of ways, we've been playing more defense than offense. And ultimately, there needs to be a bit of a pivot in relationship to that, to where we get more and more offensive about, exposing vulnerabilities before they become vulnerabilities. And so, we think that continuous compliance is going to have to become, something that is put in place versus compliance in relationship to, once in a year audit type of situation. I think that we feel that organizations right now, generally lean a little more defensively, and there needs to be a bit of a balance there to where we get more proactive about heading off some of these situations as well. And the final piece, and this probably isn't surprising, Hyperproof, the technology company, to have this opinion, but we feel that technology really has to step up here and actually help organizations solve for all of these different issues that they're facing, these threats that they're facing. And so whether it's, JC alluded, talked to quite a few different things. Certainly the threats, the way people have constructed infrastructure today, and also just the administrative work and how, we're losing a lot of, time as organizations by, in just pure administrivia. And so, we believe that technology is going to have to play a critical role in actually helping solve for some of these things that we just talked through. And with that, I'll hand it over to JC.
So wanted to share some key learnings and findings we saw around how companies are thinking about their compliance spending. When we looked at a couple of areas, one thing we really wanted to understand is whether people feel like their organization is currently spending enough to cover and address their IT compliance risks right now. What we found is actually 81% of respondents said they feel like their organization is spending enough already today. Meanwhile, we also asked people, what does your organization plan to do next year in regard to your IT compliance spending? And similar to that last one, directionally, we can see that most respondents said their organization plans to increase compliance spending year over year. So when you look at these two data points together, it seems pretty paradoxical. People are saying they're spending enough today, but they're still wanting to increase their spending for tomorrow. So why is that happening? Well, we think there's a few reasons. First of all, based on the data, which we will share later, it does seem like organizations are definitely paying a lot of attention to their processes and investments. So to cover what they think are the risks they need to cover today. But meanwhile, they're still worried about a lot of the external factors that are outside of their control. When we ask people what are the top factors that make your job more stressful, what we see very clearly is that the issues that are outside of people's control are the ones that give them the most amount of concern. And those things are things we talked about already: cybersecurity, data privacy regulations, and keeping up with just regulatory changes in other aspects as well, and making sure those are reflected in their business. Those external factors are pretty significant in how people are thinking about their compliance spending. And meanwhile, on the flip side of it is that companies have also started to realize more and more that if they want to expand their business, they also have to spend enough energy and resources to work through the compliance considerations as well. When we ask people what are the top factors driving their compliance spend increase, what's really clear is business expansion is really top of mind for a lot of folks. And as Matt was mentioning earlier, the way companies are buying software and relating to their vendors, it is changing to a point where there is more demand for verification before companies can trust their vendors. And so that's a big aspect of it as well. And so, for the organizations who told us, I feel like I'm not currently spending enough to cover my IT risk today, we asked them, where would you like to see a greater investment? And this is the data we got. I want to point out a few things here. The first thing is it's pretty clear that organizations are looking to different types of technology to address their issues, like information security technology, compliance management, and privacy management software. Those are pretty high up in this response. It's that when there's so many moving pieces to all of these issues, just having humans manage it without technology is just not going to cut it. The second theme here is this theme that, organizations are worried that they may not have done everything they need to, and they're looking for third-party experts to help them just make sure and verify they are doing all the right things. So they're hiring consultants to address IT risks, and they're spending more money on independent attestations as well. And then the final piece is a lot of organizations realize that employees are actually a point of vulnerability when employees do not have knowledge of how to protect themselves from these cyber attack schemes. So they're investing more in training programs for employees as well. Up next, I'm going to turn it back to Matt Lajo to talk about budget.
All right, budget. So thanks, JC. Yeah, we've spoken to this earlier in just a high-level data point, and I'll keep it relatively short on here. I think, obviously a lot of organizations planning to increase their compliance budgets, and I think that based on everything that we've talked about on a risk level, that really I don't think is surprising to any of us. I think we would expect organizations in response to what they're experiencing right now and the different risks we've talked about to be doing that. I think what's interesting is without getting into kind of segment by segment variances, is that it's a pretty consistent, regardless of whether it's a small organization or a large, everybody is, most organizations are planning on spending more. And maybe it's intuitively here that the large enterprises who are exposed, who operate in different markets, who operate around the world, are planning to spend a little bit more than the smaller organizations that may be more regionally specific. So I think that accounts for some of those differences. But overall, what is clear is that people are planning to spend, a lot more in reaction to some of the risks we've already talked to. Moving on, I find this one pretty interesting. What's interesting to me is just how much organizations are planning to spend, and so across the board, it's almost about 78% of the organizations are planning on spending in excess of 10%, more on their compliance budgets in the years to come. And, but that doesn't even really do it justice, because a huge portion of those organizations are planning even bigger expenditures, between 25 and 50 to 100 or more. And so, that, I guess, again, is not necessarily surprising, but maybe the increase is, right, if we think about the departments within all of our respective organizations. Most of them are more kind of oriented to either the growth of the organization or to inflation. And clearly compliance isn't actually rotating around that specific aspect. The increases are significant. And what's maybe even more interesting, it's not reflected here, but we've done a lot of research. I mean, this is, compliance spend has been going up, for up and up and up since, the mid, 2000s, if that's the right way to say it, but ever since the financial crisis back in 2007-8, we knew compliance spend was going up in response to that. But now compliance spend is actually moving up for a different reason, in relationship to all of the risks that we've highlighted already. And obviously it's pretty significant that. So just thought that was very interesting and telling about the environment that we live in. Moving on, what tools do organizations currently use? We were interested in understanding what they use to sit there and solve for their compliance issues. And we have talked to this data point before. It was highlighted in the top 10 stats, but and it's reflective of we've spent a lot of the last 18 months just talking to companies. We feel like that's where the market really is. And not surprisingly to us, spreadsheets, file storage, emails, a ton of organizations using that as their primary mechanism to sit there and solve for compliance and running their compliance programs. If anything, that number indicatively is right. It actually looks a little short in relationship to the number of organizations we've met with. And what's real interesting to me about that is it doesn't seem to be specific to small organizations or medium organizations or large organizations. It's a pretty pervasive fix for most organizations overall in what we've seen. So that one stood out. And then there are a couple that actually, we'll have to dig into more over the years to, this next year. Compliance management solutions such as GRC tools or audit management tools, based on the responses are pretty pervasively used, 1 in 2 organizations using those types of solutions. That stood out to us in a different way, in that our experience would say that organizations and the adoption of those types of tools is actually much lower than that number would indicate. And so we'll have to look into, how to look into the details of that and understand if that really is, the level of adoption that's occurred in the marketplace or not. It certainly, based on our experience, is not. I think the one that really stood out, though, is JC talked about, one of the vulnerabilities for all of us as organizations is our own people. And if you think about phishing attacks and all the different ways that cybersecurity is breached, a lot of it's via our employees. So places that stood out as underinvested in, given that point, email security, basically identity and access management. If you look at those numbers, it's basically saying 1 and 2 have focused on email security, which seems really, really small considering the level of vulnerability that exists there. And then also identity and access management being another, easy way to sit there and breach and create an intrusion. Only 1 in 4 making investments in that spot seems really short. So, we're always trying to find ways to improve at Hyperproof, and that goes to the survey as well. Maybe it's in the way that we constructed the questions, but we want to look into that further because those numbers stand out as more aberrations than what we've seen reflected in organizations investing in overall. So we'll continue to get better there, but we wanted to highlight that. Jumping forward, what tools are organizations continuing to, what do they want to evaluate? What are they looking to adopt in the next year? And their compliance management solutions were really high. So that and security incident event management. And I think a lot of it just comes down to spreadsheets, email, these types of things are not really scalable tools and really well structured to sit there and manage some of the things around compliance overall. And so, those investment areas, don't necessarily stand out as surprising. We think that that's a logical conclusion, that people, would be heading in that direction to try and change this to where it's not as much administrative work or as complicated as it is right now. Again, though, it was surprising, and this is just a reflective point from the previous slide. But if you look at email security, identity and access management, people don't have that on the top of their list. And so, we'll have to, again, like I said, look into what's going on there exactly. But it is interesting to us that those looked underserved in the previous, and they're not high on the list for people looking for tools this year. So we want to get a better understanding of that, considering the level of vulnerability that they can create. So as we find that out, we will let you know. So then we turn to our attention to asking people, well, what when we talk about the administrative work, where is kind of the time wasting occurring in compliance? Where's the frustration for organizations, and where do they not feel like they're spending their time in a productive way? And so these are some of those results. And I think we've all been here, whether it's in compliance or otherwise. Some of these things don't feel like very value-added tasks, but searching through emails to find, evidence, to provide to auditors or to review ourselves doesn't necessarily feel, I think we all prefer to just spend our time looking at the evidence and testing that evidence and verifying whether or not our controls are working or not working, and ferreting out the issues so that we can get ahead of them. And instead, we're spending a lot of time combing through emails and looking for documents, which I think all of us could agree doesn't necessarily feel like a high value use of any of our time. So that was an area that stood out. But you can see all of them, and I think all of them would resonate with almost all of us here in the business world. Filing and storing and maintaining things, it's complicated to use file storage as your mechanism to store all of your evidence. You have to be quite meticulous in order to do that. And so I can understand how that is, making sure that is done well can actually require a fair amount of time, but it's not productive time. So we just thought it was interesting to understand where people look at the administrative work and how they perceive where the issues are, and we wanted to highlight that for you. I won't read through the other four. So So moving ahead, we talked about the administrative task and we talked about how much time is actually being spent, and that really stood out to us. So the easy calculation is it's 1 in 5 days, which, everybody can do the math from there. It's 52 days a year. But those numbers really add up. I mean, the people that focus on compliance within their organizations are high-end knowledge workers in their respective space, and they cost real money, and so losing their productivity is a big deal. These aren't minimum wage resources. These are highly paid resources that have demanding jobs, and yet a huge portion of their time is actually being lost in administrative tasks. And so that really stood out to us for a couple of different reasons. One's just the sheer cost to the organization, but then we talked about playing defense and offense and moving in different directions there, and trying to kind of scale up the offense. And we feel like there's that opportunity cost that's lost in all of this too. Where the ability to play offense is lost in some ways because we're doing so much administrative work. So it's almost a compounding effect when you look at that lost time in total. And let's see. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to JC to just talk a little bit more about all of these issues that we found along the way. JC?
Yeah, so we wanted to look at, how often do organizations experience non-compliance incidents or other issues, and how much is really at stake when that happens. We found out, I think it's pretty surprising to me, that 1 in 4 organizations in the survey have experienced a non-compliance incident in the last 3 years. If you look at that a little bit differently, that means, every organization would experience a non-compliance incident in 12 years' time, statistically speaking. And so really the risk is really quite high. And so we wanted to look at how much of a loss was incurred as a result. And here's the data. A couple of things to point out here. There's definitely a spectrum of different costs here, but across all of it, the most common response was somewhere between $1 to $5 million. That's pretty significant. Additionally, we have about close to 20% of folks that they lost somewhere between $5 million and $20 million. And so that's the data there. We didn't ask them what percentage that represented as a portion of their annual revenue, but that will be an interesting thing to find out for the future. We started talking about this already, but a lot of these issues and, compliance violations, they can actually be avoided when organizations have really good processes and practices in place to correctly identify, prevent, correct these vulnerabilities. So the way we look at it at Hyperproof, we think there's really 5 key elements that are really important to put in place for organizations to really understand and correctly address their risks. And those are the 5 process elements you see here. And for the survey, we collected data to understand how organizations are managing each of these processes. So I'm going to turn it back to Matt to talk about the first piece of the whole equation, which is risk assessment.
Thanks, JC. So risk assessment. So, I think a lot of people would agree with this, but risk assessment, and the way we were looking at it was understanding how first of all, what's the risk profile for the organization overall, or risk tolerance would be the better way to say it. And then how often are you kind of, obviously you structure policies, you structure programs underneath all of that to reflect the risk, tolerance that an organization is willing to take. And what we wanted to understand was, how often organizations are actually reassessing that risk tolerance and then adjusting, their policies, their frameworks, their controls in response to that. And so interestingly, the results came back, as you can see here, with a huge portion of people saying that they are actually doing that type of organizational-wide risk assessment, to the tune of almost, 65% or so, or 64% of them saying, hey, we do it on either a monthly or weekly basis. That doesn't necessarily, I think we look at this question, and I think we'll work hard to refine it here in the next year. I don't know that people, can actually reassess their entire risk tolerance position and change their policies and procedures on a monthly or weekly basis. That seems like a really tough thing to do. I think our view is that people interpreted this and understanding where their high risk areas are, and are they actually assessing that risk on a regular frequency. And so, we'll do a better job of asking the question in the right way. But I think the positive in what these results say is that, if people interpreted it as, hey, I have high risk areas within my organization, I'm going to assess them on a frequent basis. A lot of people are clearly doing that. And we believe that that's maybe how people, looked at this particular question, and understandably so. And so I think, the positive is a lot of organizations are taking, risk very seriously and actively looking, to understand it and look for issues as they move throughout the year. And so it was interesting. It certainly wasn't the response we expected, but we'll continue to refine the program. But I did think that there were some real positives in the outcome. Moving ahead, once you've actually got your risk policy, you need to decide, hey, what frameworks, best serve me in relationship to solving for some of those risks. And our view is that there are a lot of things that need to be taken in consideration, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call know this already. But it's, clearly you need to understand the markets you serve, what kind of data you collect, and where that resides. And going through that process of understanding all those things is really the first step to understanding what frameworks are most applicable to you as an organization. And so, this is just a simple methodology to kind of work your way through that. But ultimately, all of us are different as organizations, and the answer to these questions are different every single time. And depending on what they are, that would help you actually sit there and understand which frameworks to adopt. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to JC. We did ask a specific question around what frameworks people use today, and she's going to talk you through that data.
So here's the data on what frameworks people use today or plan to use in the next 1 to 2 years. The most popular frameworks, the top two here, are Adobe Common Control Framework and the US-UK Privacy Shield at 40% and 35% respectively. This is not surprising because those two frameworks are self-attested frameworks and don't require independent assessments. So that's why I think these are popular ones for organizations. Versus if you look at some of the other ones that require independent attestation and audits, those adoption rates are definitely lower. What we could predict is, as more organizations move towards a zero trust operating model, they will be asking the organizations they work with to show more proof of their security and data privacy measures, and they won't just trust their word for it. They're going to ask for the audit reports. And so we would expect these other frameworks that require these independent attestations to be adopted even more so in the future.
So, yeah, I would agree with what JC said. I think in this verify and then trust, world that we're turning towards, for better or for worse. The adoption of a test, third-party attested, frameworks will probably go up over time because they'll be seen as a more trusted mechanism overall. But cutting over to, you have your framework in place and you need to test those internal controls. We wanted to ask questions around that too and understand how people are approaching it. And so you can see what the basic question was, and then it was a spectrum with regards to the answer from we really don't test to basically we've automated everything we can and everything is, the testing's automated and working that direction. So from the dark blue to the yellow, that was the spectrum, and then you can see the results. And I think a couple of different points to make on this. One, I think obviously as organizations we all take this stuff very seriously, and I think that's reflected in the results here. They're less than 10% of the organizations responded and said, hey, we don't really have a testing program, we're not thinking about it. And over 90% had some scale or of maturity around testing their internal controls. And that seems right. I mean, people are, I think people are working really hard to make sure that their organizations are safe and from all the damage that can be incurred. And this, I think, reflects that. I think what did surprise us, there are two other data points here. One was just the level that organizations came back and said so much of this was automated. So you can kind of see if you take the kind of, the two bars to the right on the total and actually sum that up, you're talking about almost 60% of the organizations have a high degree of automation. Which was, that one stood out as maybe a point that didn't feel right to us based on our experiences with organizations. Certainly, we know that certain controls are tested and automated, the ones that represent real risk, real high risk. But it's been rare for us to run into organizations that have the level of pervasive automated testing that's referenced here. And so that stood out as kind of a, we'll have to look again at how we ask the questions and understand whether these are really reflective of the marketplace or not. But we thought that was an interesting kind of contrarian view to what we would have expected. And then the final piece is large enterprises. It kind of stood out to me, whether it's large companies or enterprise level companies saying they don't test. That was kind of a shocking, given that the level of exposure for large organizations to not have testing programs really stood out as well, because you're still talking 6-7% of those organizations not doing any testing at all, which is contrary to what we've seen with large enterprises. They're pretty focused on that. With that, JC, I'll kick it over to you. I know we're running a little short on time here.
So all of us know that evidence is a really crucial piece of an overall compliance program. Evidence is a key part of going through an audit, as you need to find those evidence. But I think I want to highlight a couple of other reasons for why it's important to keep really good records of your compliance activities. So the first one is when if you don't keep good records, there's going to be a large loss of knowledge whenever anybody on your compliance team leaves the organization. It's going to be so hard. It's going to be pretty hard for the new staff member to understand where things were and find those things. And that's just going to, that knowledge loss can be pretty great. The second reason is just our current regulatory environment is making our lives harder. We do see evidence that regulators are enforcing data privacy laws like GDPR more stringently. And so having evidence that you have an effective compliance program in place can be a really good thing, can help protect your organization if a regulator were to investigate your organization. And then the last point here is just that we can expect more and more organizations to ask their vendors to produce evidence of compliance measures and evidence of security more and more so over time, just because we're in a really low trust environment and we don't really see that changing going forward. And so in the survey, we wanted to understand how are different organizations approaching evidence collection. And, at a high level, there's really just three approaches. The first one, the blue bar, what that represents is we don't really collect evidence regularly, so we don't have a process in place. The second option is, we have a logical process in place already. We can find the stuff, but the evidence is in a file storage system. We manage it there. Or option three, which is all of our evidence is centrally stored and managed in a dedicated compliance management software. So those organizations are saying, yes, we have a single source of truth and, it's managed pretty well. And so when we look at the data, what really stands out is, the good news is most organizations at a minimum have a logical process for collecting and managing that evidence. However, this is consistent with what we saw earlier, which is, most organizations, 57% are still using spreadsheets and file storage systems and email to manage their compliance processes. We see that here. It's really the same kind of data here. And then you can see that there are, some slight variations across the board, but what's interesting and surprising to me is actually, even though is that these larger organizations, they're not, the adoption of dedicated tools is actually not higher, even though, it's fair to assume larger organizations have greater compliance requirements and have to manage more frameworks. With that, I'll turn it back to Matt.
Thanks, JC. So I know we're running short on time, and we really appreciate everybody's patience. We have a couple of questions inbound, and so we want to respond to those. But I'll try and close this out here real quick. So approaches to compliance monitoring. We did come and ask the question around that about how organizations are approaching it. Anywhere from just not having a process at all to using external audits as the mechanism to do that, to a combination of those things to even more complicated methods. And I think what I take is a really great positive thing out of the feedback here, and it's similar to what we talked about previously. We're all taking it very seriously, and so a huge portion of all of us are actually very active in assessing and monitoring whether we're compliant or not. And so I think great work to a lot of people out there that are doing that. And so I take that as a big positive. And it probably, as far as like points that stood out here, I don't think it's surprising that larger organizations to a degree are using a broader combination. But what did probably stand out to me the most was the enterprise number here. And it's similar to what I said previously. Greater than 10% of them came back and said that they don't have a process for compliance monitoring, which was, and whether that's just people with external audits and internal audits, or whether that's a combination of that and technology, it was surprising to see that result. So that one we'll have to dig a little bit more into. But I think, kudos to everybody on the call and to a lot of organizations that, participated in the survey for being as proactive as we already are. So what did we learn? And it's going to feel a little bit repetitive, but, I think we've really learned, three different things, and I'll just go ahead and zoom right through them here. We've talked about it, obviously, security, data privacy, this verify and then trust, these types of things at this point are big issues out there for all of us. and they have a huge ability to impact our reputation in a very negative way. And so I think, obviously, and it doesn't look like any of these things are receding or declining in the level of day-to-day, the activity around all of those in a negative way continues to grow, and it doesn't look like it's going to subside. We talked about playing defense and offense, and we think that that's a really critical piece, that pivot point has to start to happen. And then we think that technology plays a big part in all of this and has to step up and play a bigger part. And so whether that's in relationship to dealing with the security and data privacy issues or managing compliance or eliminating some of the administrative work, technology is going to play an important part. And I will say, just in full transparency, Hyperproof is, we are a technology company. We're a SaaS company focused on a lot of the things that we've talked through today and helping organizations do that. And we hope to play a big part in actually helping, improve organizations' ability to respond to all of these different issues. And with that, I know we've got a short amount of time, but we'd like to get to some of the questions that have been asked and answer those. And so we'll move on to that. Mike, I think you're going to kind of bring up the questions here.
Yeah, so one of the first questions we have, did survey respondents that fall outside the scope of the CCPA show the same interest in improving data security and compliance?
Mike, that's a really good question, and it's actually one where we did not look at the data by those in that particular way, so we don't know.
I will say this though in answer to that. I mean, I think that that's very much the honest answer as far as how we conducted the survey. So I think one thing that we commit to every day is to just be honest, regardless of whether that's good honesty or an answer that everybody likes or whether it's an answer people don't like. But I will say that, I think the way that a lot of the organizations that I've spoken to, I spend most of my time talking to other organizations, they're not necessarily taking CCPA as the only guidance in the way that they're looking to respond to privacy issues. Most of the organizations I talk to are still concerned about it, even if they don't meet the criteria that would make them applicable, because they feel like if they solve for that, they feel like sooner or later there's another state that's going to enact a rule that's more pervasive than CCPA, and they may as well just get ahead of it versus being way behind it. And so, unfortunately, we didn't survey, and have a direct answer to the question, but we do see that, in my experience, organizations are looking at it regardless of their scale, because they know that it's something they have to deal with worldwide at this point.
And then the last question we'll take, are there areas that you've identified that you would like to expand the survey for future findings?
I'll go ahead and take that one. Yeah. And I would say absolutely. I mean, well, for one, in the question that was just previously, it'd be interesting to get, more in the details there. I think the one that we plan to do here in Q1, Q2 is really focusing on this verify trust issue or this zero trust issue and how people are looking to interact with their supply chain and understanding which frameworks are most trusted by organizations and help, organizations do, good commercial business with one another and work collaboratively with one another where they can trust one another. So that's the survey that we're planning to conduct here in the short term. But if if people on the call have, ideas, we'd love to hear them. That's certainly one that's real interesting to us, and I think would be interesting to a lot of folks, as we move through this zero trust environment, understanding what frameworks. I think all of us worry that we're making investments in compliance frameworks that aren't going to pay off, and ultimately we all want to make the money we're investing worthwhile, and we would like to help ourselves understand it, but also all the people that collaborate with Hyperproof and are part of the Hyperproof community. I think we are right on the hour, everybody. And from Hyperproof, from myself, from JC, from Mike, from all of us here, we'd just like to thank you for spending an hour with us. We sincerely appreciate it, and hopefully you found value in this. And we look forward to being in touch and staying in touch over the course of this year and all future years. Thanks very much again, and have a great day.